you can see multiple choice questions on any era. They're going to be based, again, on some sort of primary source document. So it could be a quote, it could be a political cartoon, it could be a map that you have to understand, or a graph. It could be a secondary document, a modern book written about something, and you have to, or maybe it's two, and you have to look at the different interpretations. So what I'm going to do is just kind of take you through the history and point out important things and some important connections that hopefully you were making, and just as a way of reviewing. What I would suggest for you guys on your own is to certainly have read that packet on the 70s, 80s, and 90s, because I'm going to try to get through a lot of that tomorrow in class, probably with each one of you up till Watergate, but in the AR session, I'm sorry, in the after school session afterwards, I'll cover things like the Carter administration, the Reagan administration, but I'm not going to really be able to cover everything in a lot of depth. Now, cross your fingers, you hope that they're not going to ask you like a major essay question about that, but you never know. We've had questions on Nixon before. There was an essay question on Reagan, but you didn't have to choose that one. So, but I'll give you enough that you should be able to take anything that they throw at you. All right, so going way, way back to where we were last September. Starting off with the 15th century. There might be a question or two about pre-Columbian societies. That meant what? Those were the Native American societies that existed prior to European contact. You should know that there were, the Americas were very well populated. Native Americans often relied upon a subsistence economy. Basically, many were hunter-gatherers, but there also was developed agriculture in a lot of areas, especially among eastern woodland Indians. And then some of the more advanced civilizations, the Mississippian culture of the Midwest, but that had pretty much died out by the time of European contact. You had the more advanced cultures of the Maya, Inca, and Aztec in Central America. So with Spanish exploration and Portuguese exploration, Central and South America becomes populated, and you have the first European contact. This is often referred to as what? The first exchange of goods. Columbian exchange. So it's an exchange of animals, plant life, as well as microbes, disease, among Europeans and Africans that were coming over with the Native American peoples. So had a big impact not only on the New World, but also back on Europe itself. So a background to this colonization was what was going on in Europe at the time. And there was a lot of turmoil over what especially? Religion, yeah. So religious turmoil. This was right during the time of the Protestant Reformation. You have some nations becoming Protestant, like England, like the Dutch, some remaining Catholic, like Spain and France. So there's a lot of infighting going on between these nations, and that's going to shape a lot of alliances and the way that they colonize. So the first major colonization effort is done by the Spanish. They had, Columbus in the 1490s discovering it. The Spanish create a system where you don't have a lot of Spaniards coming over, but they create a very strict caste system. What is that sometimes referred to? The encomienda system, where specifically that a Spanish lord would be granted land, and there would be an expectation that Native Americans that lived on that land could be required to work. So it wasn't a full system of slavery per se, but they could basically force people into labor, working in agriculture or in mining. And this very strict social hierarchy develops with those coming from Spain or from Portugal at the top, known as the Peninsulares, and then below them they would have their own children. and then below them you would have mixtures of Native Americans or African slaves and Native Americans. And so you have this strict system of hierarchy in what is called New Spain. England, in the late 16th century, starts its own exploration. They set out a few failed colonies. Those colonies proved to be very expensive because they were funded by the royal crown. And after the Spanish Armada is defeated in 1588, now England begins to send out more colonies, and the first permanent colonies are established. The first permanent English colony is at Jamestown in 1607. So the Spanish, meanwhile, had started occupying parts and exploring parts of North America. St. Augustine, Florida, for example. Coronado and DeSoto explore some of the interior of the United States. But the English are further up higher towards the coastline. Jamestown is on the Chesapeake. Jamestown's a critical settlement because this was, well, one, you have interactions with the Powhatan Indians, and so you get into these tensions with Indians, and at first they have this reciprocal trading of goods, and the Powhatan helped Jamestown survive, but soon relations start to strain between the two. Wars break out, the Anglo-Powhatan Wars. Opechancanoug's uprising in 1622 nearly destroys the colony, but they manage to survive. Why does the Jamestown colony thrive? What new tobacco? What did you say? Okay, so tobacco is imported, and this becomes an important cash crop. Along with the tobacco crop, Jamestown also, in 1619, imports the first slaves into an English colony. So Spain had already been importing African slaves. Why? Why was there a need for this new labor system, David? A lot of Native Americans dying of disease or running away, and so they start bringing African slaves over on the transatlantic slave trade. So the first slave system is set up in Jamestown, but more popular at the time was a system called indentured servitude, where basically servants would sign these contracts and agree to work for 5 to 7 years, and in exchange they might receive a plot of land after their term of indenture was over. They usually were receiving poor quality plots of land, and there's this great wealth gap between the wealthy planters, who were the ones that had the political representation. So in 1619, they also founded the House of Burgesses, which was the first self-representing government in the New World. And then you have the indentured servants. And so there's going to be this class conflict emerging throughout the 17th century between the two of them. In the 1620s, because of religious reasons, a group of Protestants that called themselves the Separatists decided to leave England. They wanted to separate themselves from the Church of England. And they came and they settled in Plymouth Rock, and that became the Plymouth Colony. And so these were the first Puritans. They were called Pilgrims. And they set up a system of self-government under the Mayflower Compact, which was signed aboard the ship when they were landing. It winds up being pretty successful. And back in England, Charles I has taken over after the death of his father, James I. And Charles I wants to rule sort of as an absolute monarch. And he starts clashing with Parliament, and especially clashing with the Puritans. And so this leads to a large Puritan migration in the 1630s. You have about 30,000 Puritans coming over in this big wave. They formed the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And these Puritans, this is kind of more of a theocratic society. It's patriarchal, run by men. Women didn't have a lot of rights. They didn't have property ownership. You had to be a full member of the church in order to vote, in order to hold political positions. They start expanding, and as they're expanding, they start to come into conflict with the Native American peoples. Now, the original Pilgrims had a better relationship with the Native Americans, mainly because those groups that lived up in that area had been decimated by disease already, and so they kind of had a reciprocal relationship. But now that you have this big wave of migration, you're starting to have some conflicts between Puritans who see the Native Americans as sort of a lesser people, that maybe that they were like devil worshippers, or they certainly weren't full Christians, and so therefore they didn't have the same rights. So they start doing things like cheating them out of land, for example. Some Puritans didn't like this, and they didn't like also the fact that there was no separation between church and state in this society. So, in 1636, a dissenter, Roger Williams, decides to challenge the authorities on this, and he speaks out against it. He's eventually banished, and he forms which colony? Okay, Providence or Rhode Island. And so, so Providence Plantation becomes Rhode Island, and there he allowed for different religions to be practiced. So you could be a Quaker, for example, and practice your religion there. He also purchased the land from Native Americans. So little by little, as the Puritans are starting to spread out, there's one group that goes and settles in Connecticut, for example, following Thomas Hooker. They are starting to abandon the original vision of John Winthrop, and that's known as the city on a hill, or a model of Christian charity. And his vision was a godly society, and that was going to be they were going to set up a society that would be viewed by people back in England as a model society, and that this would be a religious-oriented society. But little by little, other things caught the Puritans' interest, especially mercantilism and making money. And so they start getting into trading a lot, and whaling and other endeavors that, and the focus more becomes on individuals and families and making money. Now, the Puritans back at home in England were pretty successful and had basically taken over the monarchy briefly in what was known as the Commonwealth time period under Oliver Cromwell. But when Cromwell dies, there's a restoration of the monarchy. And so, so basically, with Charles II and the Restoration Monarchy, they're going to try to he's going to try to clamp down on these colonies more. The colonies pretty much have been doing their own thing. So you have these new colonies in New England, you have the colony of Jamestown, and you have Maryland as well. There's also other nations that have been forming colonial empires. France has colonized the St. Lawrence Riverway up in Canada, what becomes Canada, by up to the Great Lakes, and even explored down to Louisiana and New Orleans.